Welcome everyone to Coaching Conversations with the executive coaches of Orange County. My name is Ernest Stambouli and I am the chair at ECofOC. Coaching Conversations is a direct response to pressing issues and questions that we hear from our clients. ECofOC is a nonprofit organization that offers no-cost leadership and management development to nonprofits in Orange County. Our mission is to help nonprofits fulfill more of their mission. Our 60-plus coaches are committed to listen and offer their best coaching in helping you, the philanthropic leaders, take purposeful action in these challenging times. Our speaker today is Linda Duffy. She is the founder and CEO at Ethos Human Capital Solutions. She brings strategic human resources consulting that is grounded in 30-plus years of executive human capital experience. She is known as the people problem solver. She delivered over 100 public webinars and seminars on HR topics, including legal compliance on wage and hour issues, discrimination, leave of absence, performance management, recruiting, and compensation. And there are a few more. So she is here today to talk about returning to work under the COVID-19 cloud. And most importantly, to help you approach the present looming questions that many nonprofit leaders are grappling with. Which businesses can reopen? What must be done in order to reopen? What practical issues do I need to consider? And there's a long list of issues that she will treat during her talk. So we think that this is a very important talk, and we are going to spend more than we usually do in coaching conversations. So please be prepared to spend 90 minutes in this webinar. One more announcement. Linda is an authorized provider for HR certifications through HRCI, and you can get 1.5 hours of recertification credits for attending this webinar. To get those credits, she will need to hear from you directly. Please contact her after the webinar for that purpose, and Linda will remind you of this at the end of the talk. So here's how to participate. All webinar attendees are going to be in view and listen only mode. So please take a moment to locate and open the Q&A window in Zoom. And during Linda's talk, at any time, type in your questions in there. And before you click send, feel free to check send anonymously if you don't want your name attached to the question. And during the talk, Linda will make regular stops to check in with you and answer pending questions. I will read the questions to everyone so that the questions are heard by our video viewers later. This webinar is being recorded, and we will work on answering as many as we have time for. So with that, Linda, thank you for doing this. You have the floor.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Ernest, and thanks for inviting me to talk to everybody today. Welcome to all the participants. I've done this presentation a number of times, although you'll see as we talk through today, it's so complex, it's so complicated for a lot of different reasons, and it changes all the time. So every night before I'm ready to do a webinar, I actually update it. And if you notice on the title slide, I actually put a date on it now because we want to make sure that everybody knows that this is June 4th and that the information hopefully is current, at least as of 10 a.m. on June 4th. So on my bio slide here, you can notice a couple links at the bottom. One is a link to some general information about COVID that's on our website. You can find it there. You can also find links to prior webinars and prior emails that we've sent out on this topic. And you can join our mailing list so you can stay up to date with future information as needed. You'll also notice the other highlighted link there is for today's slides. So I think Ernest has already dropped that into the chat feature, but if you want to download the slides, just do so there. And as Ernest said, for those of you that are certified, SPHR certified or PHR certified through HRCI, just shoot me an email and I'm happy to provide you with the certificate of attendance so you can receive credits for today's webinar. Okay, so the agenda is is pretty straightforward. And as Ernest said, we'll stop periodically and I'll be happy to take questions as best I can. And then if at the end also we have questions, I'm happy to stick around as long as needed to try to answer everybody's questions. I am not a lawyer, I'm not a CPA, I'm an HR professional. So if you ask me detailed technical questions, I'll let you know if you need to go seek guidance from somebody else other than myself. Try to stay within my boundaries on that. Okay, so let's talk about guidelines for reopening. That's really sort of where we are in this whole process for a lot of our clients anyway. You know, we spent the last couple of weeks of March furloughing a lot of employees. Then we were dealing with the FFCRA when it came out, and what did that mean? We had issues with people testing positive or having potential exposure. Then we had PPP loans, and now people have funding, and so now we're sort of to the point where, okay, now what do we do to open? Now, what you have to look at when you're reopening is a whole bunch of different things. There's really no national standard for reopening businesses. The White House does have a link, and so I put that up there. I don't find it especially helpful, mostly because the requirements to comply are going to be more stringent when you take a look at city, county, and state requirements. So for California across the board, and I'm assuming that most of us are in California, there's a 4-stage approach. There's a link there to the COVID-19.ca.gov website. And that's where I go pretty much every day to see if anything's changed. I should change that slide, we're not in the current stage anymore. We had the stay-at-home order. Now we're in the current stage, which is the phase 2. And every business is going to be slightly different. And also it depends on where your county is. So starting May 8th, it was announced that we could start to reopen certain businesses like office space. But counties by county has to meet certain criteria in order to move forward into phase 2. And then higher risk businesses are going to be down the road, and the end of the stay-at-home order and large gatherings like sporting events and concerts probably will not even happen this year. So stage 2 guidelines, there's 2 parts. Like I mentioned, the county has to meet criteria, and the businesses that can open still have to follow and meet very specific guidance that you can download from that CA or that COVID-19.ca.gov website. And then the county has a criteria to meet having to do with, you know, contact tracing and how many cases they've had and things like that. Almost all there's probably about 5 or 6 counties that haven't met that criteria according to the website. But I've sort of watched, they have a map, and I've sort of watched it get filled in with color over the last couple of weeks as more and more counties met the criteria. Orange County was a couple weeks ago, and that's what allowed us, for example, to open up restaurants and have in-person dining as opposed to just takeout. So when you're thinking about opening up your business or bringing people back to the office or whatever type of business you're in, you're going to have to look at all these different things. The federal guidance, which may be that White House link, or of course the CDC. State guidance, which is on that website. You also are going to have specific industry guidance that you have to download. I'm going to focus today mostly on the office space guidance because I assume that most of us are going to be in that space. But if you're in agriculture, if you're in manufacturing, if you're in outdoor museums, it has very specific guidance in a whole bunch of different categories. So you want to take a look at that as well. Then there's county guidance. The Orange County Health Officer, I don't remember what her official title is, but you know, they just released new guidance last Friday, as a matter of fact, which I just sort of stumbled upon, but that's why this is complicated, right? So they put out guidance in terms of who has a mask, under what circumstances, things like that may not come from the state. And then you might have city guidance, like the city of Irvine has very specific guidance about masks that is a higher standard than, you know, the federal, state, or industry guidance. And then also, just as a reminder, if you're in an office building that you don't own, you're going to have to check with the building management company to find out if they have specific requirements. So for example, I was talking with a law firm client of mine the other day as I'm helping draft their plan, and I said, I need to know what your building is saying, because, for example, in their case, you know, there wasn't a requirement to wear a mask, but they're limiting people going into the elevators one at a time. So imagine if you're on a high floor, you know, everybody's going to report to work at 8 o'clock, but there's going to be a line out the door just to get in the elevator and take it up to your floor. So those are the things you need to think through, I think, when you start to reopen. So here's some overarching ideas I just like to sort of plant the seed with everybody. And the first one is, it sounds so basic, but is returning to work in person really necessary? I was speaking with a client of mine a couple weeks ago, and he said, okay, we're going to start bringing people back. And I asked a simple question, why? Are you suffering from productivity? Are you suffering from efficiency? Are your clients clamoring for it? If not, I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense to bring people back just because you can, right? So ask yourself that question, is it necessary to come back to work in person? You want to point somebody to be responsible for overseeing your COVID plan, right? So part of the guidance, and I'll be talking about this in a second, has to do with a written plan, but there's many things you have to include in it. So have a team or have a person that's going to be sort of your point person on those issues. And then also just remember, over communicate with employees, right? There's a lot of uncertainty right now. Things change. There's financial issues for people. They need to have a sense of security and stability. So you need to do your best to just communicate. No one's ever quit a job before because they said, oh my gosh, my boss talks to me too much, right? They communicate too much to me. So remember to go ahead and do that. And just be human about it, right? So that everybody's going to have a different situation right now in what's going on in their life. And so do your best just to, listen to them, help them out. And it's okay to make exceptions for people based on their situation. And then just be as flexible as possible right now. Okay, so here's some general California guidance. So this is across the board. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, all facilities must do these 5 things. So the first one is they need to perform a detailed risk assessment. So like for our clients, we've developed sort of a checklist they can use to go through and assess, the potential risk and also figure out what has to be done. And this is by site, okay? Once you have that, you actually have to develop a written plan, but it's for every work site that you have. So you could have multiple offices. Each one's going to have different risks, and you need to take a look at that. There are training requirements on how to limit the spread of COVID-19. There's individual control measures we'll talk about, and then disinfecting protocols and the physical distancing guidelines. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to focus on the office workspaces. So when you go to that website and you look for the industry guidance, again, you're going to see a whole bunch of different industries listed, starting with agriculture at the top, right? If you go down to office workspaces, then you'll see a couple hyperlinks. And this is pretty standard across the board for all of these different industries. You'll see the guidance link, and then you'll also see the checklist. Okay. And if you also notice on the checklist, you have to review the guidance, prepare a plan, and then post the checklist. Okay, so that is something you have to put together, and then you have to be able to post it so both your customers or vendors and employees that come in understand what you've done to reduce the risk so they feel safe coming into the workplace. So here's right off of the guidance that's published for the office space, and you'll notice the very first thing it says is establish a written worksite specific COVID-19 prevention plan. Okay, so it starts with that risk assessment, and then you need to go through and actually develop a written plan. And then you see the rest of it here. So identify contact, train and communicate employees. This is just the first part of a 7-page guidance that they've issued for office space, okay? It is very specific. I find the information helpful, but it is, it is a burden. It's like you have to go through at a very specific level, okay? On employee training, there's actually 9 things that you have to include in the training. So starting with, information on COVID-19, how do you prevent it? Who's most susceptible? How do you screen for it? Telling your employees the importance of not coming to work or going home from work if they have any sort of symptoms, right? Or if they live with somebody that's been diagnosed. Telling them to seek medical attention if symptoms, warrant it, right? The importance of frequent hand washing and how to properly hand wash. The importance of physical distancing. I think we're used to that phrase now, but how does that show up in the office? What does that mean for a conference room or the lunchroom, things like that, right? Proper use of face coverings, how they need to be worn. I can't tell you the number of times I go into, I haven't been going out a lot, but, going into like a Ralph's, for example, something like that, and they have their face covering on, but it's below their nose. Okay, that doesn't help, right? So things like that, showing them how to actually use it. And then you also need to make sure that your temporary or contract workers are also trained. It's not just for your full-time W-2 employees. So pretty much anybody that's going to be working at your site. And then also you have to tell them about all of the government benefits, including, the Families First, I think. I can't remember what it's called anymore. Coronavirus Relief Act, the FFCRA, for ESPL, and also so it's the emergency paid sick leave, and also the expanded family medical leave, and then any sort of workers' comp benefits. And we'll mention that in a little bit. And then you have to also step back and you have to think, how are you going to train them? Right? You can't just bring everybody in and throw them in a conference room like you might be used to doing. So are you going to prepare written materials for them? Are you going to do it via webinar? Are you going to record it? We're developing training right now for one of our clients. We're going to actually put it into essentially what's a recorded PowerPoint for them. So it'll be narrated with some slides, and then they can have employees watch it at their leisure whenever. So there's different ways to do it, but you have to stop and think about what's going to make the most sense for your organization. Okay, so let's talk about individual control measures and screening. So part of what you need to think about is, how are you going to monitor employees, and how are you going to screen employees, if at all, before they come back to work? The best guidance is to do temperature and symptom screening. Now, you can do that. You can have the employees do that at home. You can have them do it when they come to the office. It's not that there's a right or wrong way to do it, but again, you want to be thoughtful about it. And then there's also some considerations depending on which way you want to go. So for example, some of my clients have purchased the temperature guns, and they're going to train somebody, and as people come to the office, the first stop they make right at the door, they're going to have their temperature taken, right? It can be contact free at a distance. You just have to have protective equipment for the person taking the temperature. And if the temperature is less than 100.4 degrees, then they can come on in, right? You could also have them take their temperature at home. If they don't have a thermometer, then, and you're going to require that, then you're going to need to provide them with that piece of equipment. But you could say, hey, we want you to take your temperature at home. If you don't have a thermometer, then we'll do it for you at the office. You can also tell them what the symptoms are and how to screen for that. I've had conversations with different attorneys about record keeping on this, so I'll just mention, I think the best practice at this point is to not maintain those records, just because of the privacy nature of them, but also as long as you have a sound policy and procedure, you don't have to document everything. It's just a go, no go. So if the person has a temperature of 100.4 or more, they stay home or they go home, and if it's less, then come on in, right? The same thing with the symptoms. So you want to make sure that people are self-screening at home, make sure they understand what they're looking for, and then encourage them to stay home or go home if they become sick or have symptoms. And then you also want to require the use of personal protective equipment. So face coverings are strongly recommended when near others. Again, if you're in the city of Irvine, depending on the industry in, you're going to have a requirement to provide that. If you want to, you can still obviously make it mandatory. You can also say, when you're in the office, you don't have to wear it all day long if like you're in your private office, but if somebody comes into your office, you put it on. You can do all sorts of different things, but you want to make sure you're complying with, again, the building, city, county, state on it. And then of course, never share personal protective equipment. So again, EEOC has said that you can do the health screenings. You want to avoid in California any discussion of a diagnosis, which is a little bit tricky when you're talking about this stuff. But you can have them take their temperature, not screen for respiratory systems. And then again, we're advising clients not to document, but you can do that if you want to. You just want to keep it in a separate medical file. And then also remember, if you're going to have them screened when they come on site, time spent waiting in line to screen is going to be compensable. So meaning that you're going to have to pay them for it. So if they clock in once they get to their desk or, in a hallway or something like that, you're going to have to be able to find a way to adjust the timekeeping there and add a few minutes for that. Every business needs some cleaning and disinfecting protocols. And again, it's going to be different depending on the type of business you had. But you want to walk through and sort of take a look at high traffic areas, things like break rooms, stairwells, handrails, elevator controls, things like that. Again, some of this will be cleaned by the building maintenance if you're in a shared high rise or something like that. But within your own domain, you want to think through, okay, where gets the most traffic? What are things that are commonly touched, like doorknobs, things like that? toilets, you want to make sure that somebody is assigned to do the cleaning, somebody's trained to do the cleaning, they have the proper tools and equipment to do the training, because that's part of what I've said to some clients also is, okay, great, you want to bring everybody back, let's put the plan in place. Are you able to buy and stock the necessary equipment and products that you need in order to clean and disinfect? I don't know about you, I haven't been able to find like Clorox wipes or anything like that for quite a while. Maybe somebody there, you can drop into the chat where to get them if you know, but Amazon hasn't had them for a long time. Other places haven't had them. So you have to think things through like that. If you're going to require it, you're going to have to provide it, and you're going to need to make sure that you can keep it stocked. You can also adjust or modify hours to make sure that you have enough time to clean and disinfect before shifts. So if you do run multiple shifts, you want to think about that. Instead of having any sort of overlap, maybe you have a little bit of a break. You shorten shift 1 and have shift 2 start a little bit later, so somebody's responsible for cleaning and disinfecting the areas before the next shift starts. You want to, of course, avoid sharing equipment and phones, that type of thing, whenever possible. A few other things on this. Some of the guidance is, shared office equipment must be disinfected between shifts or uses, whichever is more frequent. So think about that for a second. If you have a main copier, right, a fax machine, a keyboard, conference room, you have a TV, but you have a keyboard and a mouse there. Anything that's going to get used by multiple people frequently, you need to be able to disinfect it between uses. That's a pretty high standard, right? So how are you going to do that? Again, easy if you can right there leave disinfecting wipes, right? Not so easy if you can't get them. So you want to think through that. Want to make sure, obviously, like the bathroom and any place that people are going to need to be able to wash hands and stay clean, you can staff those properly with everything. There's a list on the CDC website and obviously on the EPA website about chemicals that are approved for use to combat COVID-19. So make sure that your any products that you bring in is going to be compliant with that. And they also recommend that you can install portable high efficiency air cleaners. You can open windows and increase airflow and ventilation, but anything just to keep the air circulating is a good thing. All right, physical distancing guidelines. Obviously, we're all familiar with this now. You want to maintain at least 6 feet between workers and customers. There's different things you can do. Some of my clients are taking out from conference rooms, for example. They've measured it and they figured out, okay, this is how we can have people, and the most people we have in here. We've posted occupancy signs, for example, to say, max occupancy in the conference room is 6 people or things like that. And then they physically mark the floor to be able to say, here's where the chairs go. And then I've also seen, I also saw a law firm recently that bought like a partition. It was like a freestanding, had like a base, but a freestanding piece of glass that they could put on their conference room table, so you could still see across it. But because the conference room table wasn't 6 feet across, that way people could work at the table and see each other and talk. But there was something blocking that. Just like now, if you drive through a drive-through, you'll see that they've put up partitions, right? So you can do things like that. Obviously, you can use telework options and modified work schedules. Again, if there's not a reason to bring people back to the office, my advice is just don't do it. But even in the office itself, you can still have a Zoom meeting, right? It sounds sort of silly, but we're all used to that, being at home, but there's no reason you can't do that when you're back in the office. So you can obviously need to think through office space cubicles, how it's laid out, how close people are going to be, and then close or restrict common areas. So don't let people just congregate, like not in the lobby, not in the lunchroom, around the water cooler, or wherever. A lot of clients, best practice to establish directional hallways and passageways, meaning, if people come into the lobby, but if they need to walk to the back of the building, they go one direction. But if you're back there and you need to go back up front to the lobby, you actually, if there's an exit you can take and go down outside and come back in. So everybody's going in one big direction, that's great. If you have, imagine like a big sort of rectangle with maybe a couple hallways, you have one hallway going one way, the other hallway going the other way, so people aren't passing face to face. You're going to limit the number of people riding the elevator. Like I said, you want to post signage there. That could be from, the building management company. And then just limit the number of people at the office at one time whenever possible. You can stagger start times. You could split your shifts. Another one of my clients has like group A and group B. Group A is in the office this week and group B is working at home, and then next week they switch. So B comes to the office and A goes home, right? So they only have half the employees there. I was reading last night, same thing about working on projects. You're assigned a group of people to work together. You all work at the same time. You may use the conference at the same time, but then, everything gets clean before another group comes in. So just think through the best way to do that. You want to stagger meals and breaks, but remember to maintain compliance with wage and hour regulations. For non-exempt employees, they have to start their meal period before the end of their 5th hour. So if everybody's going to take their meal period, at noon, that's not going to work too well. You also want to try to avoid having them work at their desk for all the reasons we always tell you that, because you don't want people to interrupt them, and they need to be completely relieved of duty during their meals and breaks. So that may mean you need to require them to go outside or go use their car or something like that. Or you just stagger time and say, okay, you're going to start at 7:30, you're going to start at 7:45, you're going to start at 8 o'clock, 8:15, 8:30, and then you take your meal periods accordingly. So there's a little bit of relief there, and not everybody's in the lunchroom or break room at the same time. Obviously, you want to suggest that people avoid, handshakes, hugs, all those similar types of greetings that we're used to, and make sure that when visitors come in that they're directed wherever they're going to go quickly, so they're not all just waiting in the lobby for you. A lot of clients also I have just had a no visitor policy pretty much since March, so they don't have visitors or vendors coming into the lobby at all, and that's perfectly fine as well. One of the things that I thought was interesting, an interesting suggestion is, instead of, let's say we're working on something and I need to take papers to you, instead of me walking up to you and handing you papers or going to your office or desk and handing them to you, that you establish an area where you can put them down, and then, I would be able to text you and say like, hey, I just left you the paperwork over on this shelf or wherever, wherever you designate, and then you can go get it. And that way we don't have to have any sort of handoff or come within 6 feet of one another. You also want to discontinue non-essential travel. The question is, what's essential, right? So you want to think through, what your policy is going to be about travel, who can travel, where they can travel. Are you going to require them to self-quarantine after they travel, or work from home for 14 days after they come home from travel? So all of those things should be discussed, decided, and then communicated to the employees. So let's talk about third parties for a second, and then I'll stop to see if there's any questions. So bringing in third parties, like I said, you can't have a policy that just says we don't bring in third parties right now. But what if you need temps, right, to help out or something like that? What's your policy going to be on testing them? I would say if you're going to use temps, you're going to want to talk to the temp agency if you're payrolling through an agency, because that's a joint employer situation. You want to find out what their policy is. What are they requiring of their employees? Are they okay with you temperature testing, the employee when they come on site? So figure that out. You're going to have to provide PPE if you're going to require it, at least to the temps. But you could tell your vendors and your clients, before you come on site, this is what we're requiring. Again, speaking with the law firm that I'm writing their policy for them right now, what we decided to do is, they're an estate planning firm, and so they have clients come in that have to sign documents, get them notarized, all sorts of things, right? Or who want to meet with an attorney face to face. So they're limiting the people that are going to be in the conference room, but before a client comes in, they're going to have an email that they send to the client to say, here are all the steps we're taking to make it a safe environment, and basically here are the rules. What do you need to do? So you need to wear a mask, or you don't need to wear a mask, or whatever it is, right? Tell them that. Tell them where they go when they get there if things have changed. So all of those things, you want to make sure that people coming into your facility know what you're doing to make it safe. You're going to have to post that checklist again, and also what requirements you have of them. And then also think about eliminating shared resources at the front desk. So a lot of times I go out on site and I'm asked to sign into, like a logbook when I get there, a visitor log. They hand me a pen and then I hand it back to them, right? You don't want to do that anymore. So maybe the receptionist goes ahead and signs everybody in, or maybe you ask people to use their own pen, but you don't want to be sharing resources like that. Similarly for deliveries, what you want to do is make it as contactless as possible for pickup and deliveries of products. And one of the best practices is to designate like one specific entry point for people, if at all possible. So in office space, that's pretty easy because normally it's going to be, the front reception area, but you could have a policy that they leave it outside, right? And then somebody goes out and gets it, so they don't actually come in the building. If there's a warehouse area, maybe send everything through the warehouse and then have the warehouse people distribute it as necessary. Wipe it down first, whatever your practice is going to be. Okay. All right, Ernest, do we have any questions so far?
No questions so far. I have a quick question for you.
Okay.
Oh, hang on. There's a question that popped up. Let me read it. From Raphael, thank you for the question. How would leaders address employees who are not willing to come back to work due to safety concerns?
We're going to get to that. I appreciate that question, Raphael. Just hold that thought because I have a couple of scenarios. At the end, we're going to discuss through things like that. And what if someone tests positive? What if someone's unwilling or unable to come back to work? So we will definitely address that. Ernest, what's your question?
My question is around the meaning of certain words that we hear a lot. So from what I understood so far, we're getting guidelines from the authorities. And I've also heard the word requirement. And I think you use the word requirement in the context of what you implement within your organization. My question is, what are the consequences for not following the guidelines for a given organization? Putting aside the medical consequences, I'm talking legal consequences, social consequences.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't tell you who the COVID police are, but I can tell you we've had not our clients, but we've had knowledge of situations where companies are opening up in violation. I haven't heard of those recently. It was more before, like I know of like salons and massage parlors and places like that who tried to remain open and they got shut down. I mean, early on, the governor signed an executive order that allowed like electrical companies, gas companies, utilities companies to turn off power, water, electricity and stuff to any of those businesses that were in violation. I've also read things where people can call and report violators, right? So it's what's difficult, I guess, Ernest, is there's a lot of things to comply with. People have different viewpoints. I talked to one client and they want to do everything possible and they want to limit everything and they're going to be super strict. Everyone's going to wear a mask. And I talked to the next client and they're like, they stop short of calling it a hoax, but they don't have any concerns at all and they want to do as little as possible. So every situation is going to be a little bit different. The one thing I should mention, though, when you go back to that slide where it says, here's the federal, state, county, city, building, everything that you have to comply with, you always have to comply with the strictest standard, right? So for example, if Irvine says, hey, you have to wear a mask when you go into, if you go out in public, you're going to have to wear a mask. If they say you have to wear a mask when you're in an office, you're going to have to wear a mask, even if the state doesn't require it. So you're right. There are things that are guidance, there are things that are best practices, there are things that are musts, and you need to make sure that you understand the difference between those two things.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's keep going. And if you have other questions, just drop them into that Q&A feature, that chat feature, and Ernest is monitoring that for me, which I appreciate. Thanks. Okay, so a couple things to also know about OSHA and Cal-OSHA. So there's a general duty clause from OSHA in this particular act, right? And I give you the citation here. And it requires employers to furnish workers with an employment and place of employment which are free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. Everybody's interpreted that to include COVID-19. So you want to go to that particular 29 USC, that particular location, and take a look at what the requirements are under that, as well as reviewing OSHA regulations at 29 CFR section 1904. It'll walk you through a whole bunch of different things. In California, we have a specific requirement to have an injury and illness prevention program. So a lot of those things are already going to be included, but you want to make sure that you're looking at this and complying with OSHA and Cal-OSHA standards as well. On the IIPP, the link that I have there on the bottom of that slide is actually an e-wizard. We do audits of our clients and we'll go into a new client and we'll ask them, can we see your IIPP? And they're like, what's that? right? It's a requirement for employers in California to have that written injury and illness prevention program, and that link at the bottom is like a wizard that you can answer some questions and then it spits out a plan for you. Okay, so if you don't have that, you want to, and you also want to think about how you want to incorporate COVID-related things into that, because there is a requirement to have a written, prevention and response plan. You can have it as a standalone plan and just reference it. You could do it as an addendum. Some companies before with like the swine flu had a pandemic response policy they developed. So now they just have to tweak it a little bit for COVID, right? So it's not a bad thing to spend some time on right now. So if in the future we have other types of pandemics or contagious viruses or whatever it is, you're ready to go automatically. Okay, so there's a lot of policy changes that you're going to want to think through. And again, I'm going to remind you all to think through how to communicate these to your employees, right? So first and foremost, we have paid leave policy changes by law, right? So when the FFCRA went into effect, there's a requirement to post, there's a poster that you have to post and allow employees to know about that. For a lot of my clients, we furloughed people in March before that went into effect. Now, as people are coming back, they're like, oh yeah, I'm entitled to EPSL or I'm entitled to EFMLA. And so you want to think about how you're going to dovetail those with whatever benefits you're already providing to your employees, because this is really above and beyond that, right? Think about your attendance policies. As a culture where I think, most of my clients, we talk to them about, there's so many, tardies or missed days that you can have before we're going to write you up or fire you. And so people have a tendency to come to work when they're sick because they don't want to get in trouble, right? Well, that's not going to work to your advantage right now. So you want to make sure that, you err on the side of, encouraging sick employees to stay home, regardless of whether it's COVID, right? I think we're all recognizing like, hey, you know what? I don't really care if your cough or cold, or, your sniffles or your whatever is COVID. I don't want you in my office anyway, right? If you're at all sick. So think about your attendance policies, and are you incentivizing people to come to work when maybe you shouldn't be? Also along those lines, what are your time off request procedures, and do they need to be modified or clarified for everybody? So if somebody is at home and they have symptoms of COVID, you should know about that, right? So what's the process that you want them to use to notify you? Do they just call their boss and say, hey, I'm out sick today? Do they say, hey, I have some symptoms related to this? What if they're calling out sick unrelated to COVID? What do they do, right? And then when you send a person home, how are you going to track that as well? Flexible scheduling options. If you're going to change people's schedules up, you want to communicate to them as well. Travel policy I mentioned before, who can travel under what circumstances, and what do you do when they come back? This obviously, people have probably already thought through this, but telecommuting and IT policies. We have some of our clients who had never allowed people to telecommute. Now they're actually wondering if they need office space, right? They've gone 180 degrees, but we had to help them get a telecommuting policy in place, have each employee sign a telecommuting form, making sure that they're agreeing to certain things. And then also, what are IT policies? If I issue a laptop to an employee and they have them work at home, what can and what can they do on it and what shouldn't they do on it, right? Can they play games on it? Can their kid use it to do their homework, right? Can they surf the web at night on it? Think about those things, because you probably, you have that policy for in your office. You want to make sure they know it applies to any equipment that you issued them and they take home. And then of course, the big policy is going to be how to handle employees who test positive or who has symptoms. The other thing that's sort of new is workers' comp. And while I will tell you, honestly, I think this was a bad decision on the governor's part. A month ago, he said that basically it's a rebuttable presumption, was the phrase he used, that if an employee tests, comes down with COVID, tests positive for COVID, it's going to be considered a workers' comp claim. Okay. Now that's not true for employees working at home, but for anybody that's working in an office, as you bring employees back, if one of them contracts the disease, the assumption is it happened at work, even though they're spending 16 hours outside of work. So the rebuttable presumption means you're going to have to prove that it didn't happen at the office. So good luck with that. I'm not sure how you would do that unless maybe somebody they live with tests positive and you can point to that, right? But it would almost have to be that way. So you're going to want to contact your workers' comp carrier, ask them, at what point that becomes a recordable injury. what their policies and procedures are, what their advice is, because I have a feeling that they got caught off guard by this as well. Because here are some things we don't know, like who's going to pay for the testing now, right? So before, a healthcare provider, like a Blue Cross Blue Shield, a Kaiser, whatever, they were paying for the testing. Well, if you're coming to me telling me that it's work related, then is the workers' comp carrier going to, provide the testing? Are they going to pay for it? We don't know the answer to some of these questions. How will workers' comp benefits blend with EPSL? If an employee stays home because a healthcare provider has told them they need to stay at home and quarantine, you have a duty to pay them the 80 hours of EPSL. But if it's a workers' comp claim, then the workers' comp carrier should be paying them temporary disability. So those are some of the things we just don't know. And I'm going to encourage you just to go to your workers' comp carrier and ask the question now so that you're prepared when and if, hopefully it never happens, but if and when it happens. Okay, so we've talked about sort of everything you have to think through in terms of getting your workplace ready to bring people back to work. Now let's talk about how you're actually going to do that and some of the things to consider and the issues that we've seen come up. So first and foremost, you want your decision making to be non-discriminatory. I say that, and yet, last week I got a call from somebody that was telling me about their employer told them they were going to bring only the men back right now. So I say that and I sort of laugh because I think this should go without saying, and yet apparently it needs to be said. So you want to think about it, and when I say non-discriminatory, you can do it based on the type of job. You could do it on seniority. You could do it on so many different things. It just can't be done based on age, race, gender, or any other protected category. Okay. You also want to make sure you always look in the rearview mirror on any of your decision making. So your intent is not to discriminate, right? You say, oh, I'm going to do it based on whatever. And then you look and you go, oh, I just eliminated all of this one class of people inadvertently. So you want to take a look and make sure there's not a disparate impact on any group of people. Okay. One of the things we suggested is you could always do it based on some sort of merit system. So like with one of our clients, it's a brewery, they started to bring back hourly people. Well, they couldn't bring back all of the people. And so what we suggested they do, since they haven't had like recent performance appraisals, is just have all of the managers force rank their employees. They came up with, I think it was attendance, attitude, and like job skills or something like that. And on a scale of 1 to 10 for each of those categories, making it a total of 30 possible points, rate each of these people and just hold on to that. So then as jobs opened up and they need to bring people back, they took the first 5 or they took the first 10 or whatever it was on the list, but they had documentation. So if somebody accused them later of some sort of discriminatory decision making, they could say, no, this is how we did it. Here's another thing you can think about doing. So let's say you have 20 employees, but you really only need 10 full-time people. You could bring 10 back and leave the other 10 furloughed, or you could bring everybody back at half time and you could do it under this work share program. So hopefully you know about this program, but I find that a lot of employers don't. And I think it is such a win-win right now that I want to just spend a minute telling you how this works. So right now, if you have employees on furlough, you're going to send them, to apply for unemployment, and they're going to get a percentage of their, base period wages up to $450 a week, right? So what's happening is sometimes you'll call up an employee and say, hey, come back to work. But if they make more in wages than $450, they're not going to get any unemployment. Right now, that's a big deal because they're also getting the supplemental $600 from the feds, right? So we're running into that where employees are saying, oh, no, thanks, because they're making more money at home. Workshare is a little bit different in that you're essentially applying for unemployment on their behalf because you're going to have a plan approved by the state and you're going to say, hey, I'm cutting their pay by 50%. So let me give you an example, and I should have a slide on this because there's math involved, but let's say somebody makes usually $1,000 a week, right? And you say, hey, I want to bring you back at halftime. They're going to make $500 in wages, which is greater than their $450 in benefits. They're not going to get benefits from the state. They're not going to get benefits from the feds. So now they have to live on the $450. Under the work-share program, not only would they keep the $500 they made in wages, they would get a proportionate amount of their weekly benefit. So in this case, they would get half of that $450 on top of that. And because they're getting even $1 from the state, they would get the $600 from the feds. It is a huge difference between if they apply on their own versus as part of a program. So there's rules around that. We're helping a lot of clients apply, so if you need help with that, give us a call. But go check out the Workshare program on that link. There's information, the application, everything. We're being told it's taking roughly 2 to 3 weeks to get it approved, but this may be a way that you can phase employees back into the workforce without remaining some employees at home, because if I bring 10 back and I leave 10 at home, those 10 don't know when they're coming back. So if they have a job opportunity someplace else, they may take it, right? Where this way, they're going to be tied to you and they're going to be more loyal to coming to work for you, okay? So let's talk about now, back to Raphael's question, sort of how to handle employees who are unwilling or unable to return to work. And I think those are two very different things, right? There is a requirement to notify EDD of those who are recalled to work. I will tell you, I cannot figure out how to do that. We have been all over their website. So I know we can tell people, or we can tell EDD and they're going to know because there's going to be wages reported for them. What we don't know how to tell them is, hey, I offered Ernest the opportunity to come back to work and he declined. I don't know how to notify EDD that he didn't accept the return to work. So we have a requirement to that, don't know how to do that. You want to keep a record though. If I do make an offer to Ernest, for example, to come back to work and he refuses, you want to make sure that you have both of those things in writing, the offer in writing and then also the refusal, because if you have a PPP loan, SBA said they're not going to count that against your forgiveness. Okay, so it's really critical that you hold on to that. And then you also want to talk about a plan for high-risk employees. Okay, so let's look at a few different scenarios. So if someone's unable to return to work, it could be that they can't do it for one of these reasons that are covered by the emergency paid sick leave, right? So real quickly, you want to take a look at what's the reason, right? Why are they saying they can't come back to work? And if they can't come back for one of these reasons, then you would be required to pay them the emergency paid sick leave. So the first one is that the employee is subject to some sort of, quarantine order, right? So we believe that to include the stay-at-home order. So if your business is not part of phase 2 or you're not yet open, and the person isn't working, and that's the reason they're not working is because you're closed or there's no work for them, then this doesn't apply, right? But let's say you call somebody up and you say, hey, why don't you come back to work? And then that person's over the age of 65 or they have an underlying health issue. We believe that that would trigger this first reason, and they could legitimately say, I can't come back to work. And not only would you need to leave them out and accommodate them by providing them with time off potentially, but you would also need to pay them the 80 hours of EPSL. The second one and the third one go sort of hand in hand. If a doctor says to somebody, hey, maybe you go to the doctor, or the employee does telemedicine and the doctor says, yep, it looks like you could have, COVID-19, then you need to stay home and self-quarantine. That's going to trigger number 2. If the employee is experiencing symptoms and they're trying to get a medical diagnosis, they're trying to get tested, for the time spending, making the appointment, attending the appointment, getting tested, all of that time is going to be paid under this as well. If the employee is caring for a person who is sick and has been advised to self-quarantine, then that's going to trigger number 4. And again, for all of these, you're going to want some documentation, because remember, if you pay out money under the EPSL, you can seek to get tax credits to offset those funds, but it's going to require some sort of documentation. So on number 4, it can't just be anybody, but it needs to be somebody that would be where there'd be a reasonable expectation that the person needs to care for them. So it could be a family member, it could be someone they live with, things like that. And then the 5th one is you could bring people back and they could say, hey, I can't come back to work right now because I've got kids at home because the schools got shut down. It's going to be interesting to see how often that happens in the next few weeks, because this would have been about the time the school year ends. So there's also guidance from the Department of Labor that says, yeah, you don't have to pay it if now in summer, because they would have been under the situation anyway, right? That's what I've been saying all along is, well, what's going to happen in summer? And the DOL says we don't have to pay them, but if, let's say, your plan for the summer is they're going to go to camp and the camp's not open, then you would be back to needing to pay them under this. And remember, For number 5, if the person is eligible there, then that also is going to trigger the need to offer them a paid leave of absence under the expanded FMLA. Okay, so I will get to,
Is
yeah,
now a good time to answer additional questions?
Sure.
So we have 3 questions on the board. First is Martha. How do you handle proper ergonomics at home? Someone wants to pick up their office chair. Someone has only a laptop at home and a kitchen table and chair.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we have had that happen with one of our clients as well, where an employee said he was having like neck pain. And we think it's because he just doesn't have a proper setup at home. Thankfully, that hasn't come up a lot. You know, there are, you could, what I would say is go to your workers' comp carrier and see if there is like an ergonomic specialist, or maybe not your workers' comp carrier, but you're like your broker for your workers' comp carrier, and ask them if they have like an ergonomic specialist or somebody that could maybe evaluate the person's workspace. That could be done maybe visually, like with a Zoom call or something like that, but have somebody take a look at it. Ask the employees what they need. So we did the same thing. They're used to having, like, I have a CPA firm, everybody's working at home. They're used to having 2 monitors on a desk. I was talking to someone yesterday, she's got 1 monitor plus the laptop, and it's hard to see on the laptop. And so we're trying to figure out how to do that. If they're gonna stay home for an extended period of time, maybe you let them take their chair home, right? You don't have to necessarily furnish them with all new office equipment, but you should do whatever you can to support them. And usually those accommodations aren't that expensive, right? To allow that. Or maybe if it's a chair that they want to keep for the future, you provide them some sort of subsidy, toward that chair, something like that, and then they can keep it later on. But yeah, I would see what you can do about providing them with a resource to help evaluate their personal situation and make it as comfortable as possible for them.
Question from Athena. If the employee files for benefits and ask a question, did you decline work, and they mark yes, they need to explain if employee states no, EDD, sent a form to the employer to confirm, and you consent to EDD that you offered them to work. Okay, that's a comment and not really.
Okay, well, let me just address that. Well, let me address that, Athena. That's awesome if that happened that way, right? But I'll tell you, just yesterday, we had some of our clients, because we process payroll for some of our clients, and so they send us the EDD forms, right? So I can't tell you, in the last week, we've probably had, I don't even know, a half dozen forms that on the form, how it says in the upper right-hand corner, you have 10 days to respond from the date, this date, right? The dates on those forms that they just got this week were dated in April, okay? Like April 10th. Okay, the postmark on the envelope was like May 26th. So they are so far behind trying to catch up on stuff. It is ridiculous, right? And I mean, it's ridiculous, but God bless them for trying to keep up, because this is unprecedented, right? But I'm just saying, I don't have any faith that that's going to happen. Maybe when the employer, if the employee does, and that's a big if, the employee does honestly report that they turned down work, then yes, maybe that gets generated. And again, I'm going to talk in a second about how to handle it if somebody just flat out refuses to come to work. But anyway, so that's a big problem that we're having. We've also had a similar problem where employees have honestly reported that they have been back to work, and EDD's continuing to pay them. I talked to a woman yesterday. She's got $6,000 of benefits on her debit card that she knows she's not entitled to, and she's not going to spend, but she doesn't even know how to return it. She's told them that she's back at work, and they continue to pay her. So yeah, I think a lot of this will get caught up at some point in time, but it's not that straightforward. But thank you for that idea.
One question.
Yeah.
Due to COVID, what if an employee has an underlying health condition, are not protected by FMLA or CFRA, and cannot return to work? Can we be liable for ADA violation if we release them because we cannot give the employee reasonable accommodation?
Potentially, right? Potentially. So, if we go back to these reasons on here, number one, if you go on the state page, they're very clear. They would prefer anybody age 65 or older, or if you have an underlying health issue, that you self-quarantine, right? So we do believe that that's going to trigger the 80 hours. Now, they're still going to be over age 65 in 80 hours later, right? So it's like, that's the problem, is now what do you do? So you're going to have to go through, I think, the interactive process with them to figure out what type of accommodation they need. If they can continue to work from home, I would allow them to continue to work from home, right? If you cannot allow them to do that and you need to fill the position, then you're going to have to make a really tough call. And I would suggest you get an attorney involved. We're going to see lawsuits on this. There's no question about it. I had a virtual breakfast yesterday with an employment attorney, and he was saying that they're already starting, right? So yes, there's a potential ADA claim there. There's potential, you know, I didn't accommodate you claim. I'm missing the phrase right now, right? Failure to accommodate. So be really careful about firing anybody, especially if they have an underlying health issue. Now, one of the things that we've had a couple of our clients do is just put them on a leave of absence for the time being, and just say, okay, well, you know, we'd like you to come back. We understand that you don't want to for this reason. We're just going to put you on an unpaid leave of absence. So pay them the 80 hours if it triggers number one, and then just leave them on a leave of absence for as long as possible. Any other questions?
One more from Janice. What test can we use to test ourselves or others we work with?
Test? Is that what you said?
What test?
Okay, so there's two things the CDC recommends. One is a symptom check, and then one is the temperature check, right? So as I said earlier, if you go back to that slide, you can do a temperature check, whether you have employees self-check at home or when they get to the office, you can have, you know, one of those guns that will, you know, monitor somebody's temperature. If the temperature is 100.4 degrees or higher, they should not come to work. Okay, so that's on the temperature side. The symptoms, you can go pull a list of symptoms off the CDC website. You know what most of them are, but it's, you know, it's cough, shortness of breath, you know, general respiratory symptoms. There's things like loss of taste and smell. There's you know, there's a list of about 8 or 10 different symptoms. And what I would do if I were you is prepare that list and sort of, you know, give everybody like a list and say, hey, every day before you come to work, you need to self-check and make sure you don't have any of these symptoms. The tricky part really from my perspective is I have allergies, right? Like you see me probably like I'm itching and all sorts of stuff. I have allergies and today for whatever reason they're bad. So I often have a cough. It's not related to COVID. This is like my normal, right? I have a cough because of allergies. So that's where it gets a little tricky. You want to, you know, you have to sort of err on the side of caution and probably have them stay home. Hopefully they can telecommute, right? But if the cough is ongoing, you're going to want them to go to the doctor before you bring them back in. Anything else?
No questions for now.
Okay, great. So a few more slides and then I'll go through some exposure scenarios and then we'll stop and that'll be the end and we'll take some more questions then. So, okay, so you've decided to bring people back to work. Hopefully they come back, right? Here's new hire paperwork that you're going to have to think through. So if the employee was furloughed, then generally new hire paperwork isn't required. If you're changing their position, they're changing anything that goes on that wage theft notice, which is the California Labor Code section 2810.5 form that has to be given out to all non-exempt employees. Just a friendly reminder, make sure you issue that, because we had that situation with like our brewery client. They got PPP funds. They started bringing hourly people back into different roles because the brewery wasn't open. And so when you change their title, you have to issue that form again. Okay, so that's one thing. If the employee was laid off, then the employee has to be rehired almost as though they're a new employee. Having said that, there's certain things you want to check on, you know, that are benefit related. So first of all, sick pay must be reinstated. So remember that if they had sick pay left over when you laid them off, that has to be reinstated to them under the sick pay law from 2015. You can, instead of having them fill out a new form I-9, you can recertify in section 3 on their prior form. Just remember that if they were hired before February of this year, then you need to certify and fill out section 3 on the new form I-9 that went into effect earlier this year, okay? Some healthcare providers and 401k providers will waive any sort of waiting period, right, for people that are rehired or if they've only had a break for a certain period of time. So check with them to see, can you get them back on your plans right away? Also remember there's been some changes, right? Telemedicine is now like the law is catching up with reality, right? Telemedicine, make sure that your healthcare policy covers that, right? Make sure it gets added in there so people can take advantage of that. Flexible spending accounts, over-the-counter medicines are now covered again. They were a long time ago, now they're back. So make sure that those get put into your plan as well. And then the 401k under the CARES Act and the Secure Act, they gave expanded rules for hardship withdrawals and loans to make it a lot easier for people to access their funds for those reasons, right? So the amounts can be taken out, there's all sorts of different rules. So make sure that you look into that and you can provide that information to your employees as well. The other thing to know is that the USCIS came out a few months ago and said, hey, we understand that everybody's working remotely. So if you have a new hire and you need to certify their documents for the Form I-9, they now have specific guidelines to allow you to certify those documents, because normally you have to inspect them in person, right? Inspect the originals. So now that they have a policy and a practice so you can do that remotely, and then later on, if and when you bring them back into the workplace, you're going to have to update that. But check out that link because that'll help you also remain compliant. So let's talk about compensation. So will pay cuts be made? Will they be revoked? Like maybe before you cut somebody's pay, now you're going to make them whole again, right? So think through those type of things and let people, again, know what you're going to do. Because where I find that we get in trouble, and this is sort of my rule 101, don't mess with someone's paycheck, right? If you bring people back, and let's say you made pay cuts before this happened, or they've been telecommuting and you cut their hours or pay, they may just automatically assume by coming back to the office, they're going to be made whole. And if that's not your intent, right, then say so. If that is your intent, then say so. So there's no confusion about it. Some of my clients have provided hazard or hero pay. Like I've got a client, they're paying them more money because they're working in a warehouse. Everybody else is, working from home, but they've had to come to the warehouse and do shipping and receiving. So they've been paying them extra money. Is that going to continue? For what period of time? You may not know for how long it's going to happen, but I would say just, maybe check in with them and say, we'll decide at the beginning of each month what we're doing, and just tell them that, right? And then just keep, communicating with them. You might have had some employees where annual pay increases or reviews were missed. So how are you going to catch those up? Or maybe you have focal point reviews and you did it in March. Just don't assume that everybody thinks like, oh, well, obviously we're not going to do those, right? Because that's not what they're thinking. They're thinking, oh, I missed a raise or I missed a review. So just tell them. It's fine to say you're not going to do them, but just tell them that. Also bonus plans or commission plans, right? How is coming back to work, or how has this whole last couple of months affected their bonus or their commission plan, and what are you going to do about it? If I had a commission plan or a bonus plan tied to some level of productivity, and obviously I haven't been able to do anything, does that mean I don't have a bonus? Are you willing to work with me on adjusting the plan specifics, right? And then just a quick note on rules for changing compensation. You can change a non-exempt or hourly person's compensation pretty much any time. You have to do it going forward and not retroactively, right? So you don't come in today and say, oh yeah, I changed your, starting like last week, we're only going to pay you a certain amount, right? You can do it though, saying, hey, starting tomorrow, starting next week, starting on the next payroll period. I would suggest so your payroll person's head doesn't explode, you make it effective the first of a payroll period. So for non-exempt employees, it's pretty easy. Exempt employees, remember that not only is there a duties test, and that could be, you need to take a look at that if they're not really managing people. And let's, like our brewery client, we furloughed all the hourly people. We kept the general manager, assistant general manager, and the kitchen manager, but are they still performing exempt duties, right? If they're the ones cooking the food and taking the orders and working as though they were hourly, right? So you have the duties portion, but you also have the minimum threshold for salary in California, right, which is higher than the feds. So if, depending on the number of employees, it's either 49,000 or 54,000 and change, right? So what you want to do is just remember that if you're going to bring them back on a part-time basis, you can cut their salary, but it cannot go below that threshold, right? So if you bring them back at 50, 50%. You can't cut them down to 30,000 a year if they were making 60,000 a year, because that throws below. But you can convert them to non-exempt if you want to. So we have this question a lot. We're going to bring somebody back that's exempt. They're going to be part-time. Can we cut their pay? Yes, as long as it doesn't go below. Or a better way to do it is might just take their exempt salary, divide by 2080, which is the number of hours, work hours in a year, and then just pay them hourly. And if they work overtime, you'll pay them overtime. Okay. All right. So communication, you've heard me mention this a lot. Over communicate. Employees don't get it the first time, second time, third time you say it to them sometimes. So keep telling them everything you're doing. So what steps we're taking, are being taken to reopen safely, what policies are in effect, if your comp or benefits is going to change, anything like that. Think through how employees and third parties are going to be trained and communicate all of this stuff to them. You want to be prepared with communication materials in the event someone tests positive. There is a requirement, and we'll talk about this in a second, but if somebody tests positive, you need to inform any sort of exposed coworkers, and so you're going to want to prepare that communication material ahead of time. And then also have a media communications person identified. So heaven forbid something happens, like Tyson food plant, right, where they have 500 employees test positive and there's a major outbreak, right? You want someone identified and trained to be the main point of contact with the media in case you get approached. Okay, so I want to go through a few different scenarios because these are some of the common things that are coming up, and talk about how to respond to them. And then again, that'll be the end, and then I can take any other questions. So the first one, if an employee has symptoms. So obviously the first thing, stay home, go home, right? If they're at the office, you want to isolate them as quickly as possible and have them sent home. They should seek medical advice. Their doctor will tell them whether or not they need to get tested and what to do about getting tested. I'll also tell you that this website has been up for a couple weeks on the California website. They have different locations. You can actually go in and put in your zip code, and it'll direct you to where you can go to get tested now. So everybody should go just check that out. And then also remember that your employee may qualify for the emergency paid sick leave if they're going home because they have symptoms. Okay. The rule from the CDC says they should not return to work until they have no fever, and that's meaning without meds. And this is all and, okay, so no fever, and that's without any sort of fever reducing meds, right? And the respiratory symptoms have improved for at least 3 days. They don't have to be constantly gone or completely gone, but they have to have improved for 3 days, and 10 days have passed since the symptoms began. Okay, so those are the rules for bringing somebody back to work if they have symptoms. Okay, no fever for 3 days, symptoms have improved for 3 days, and it's been at least 10 days since the symptoms began. All right, here's exposure scenario 2. If a worker is exposed outside of work to someone who tests positive, right? So first and foremost, you have to remember the definition of exposure. Definition of exposure is prolonged contact with somebody within 6 feet, right? Or a household contact, meaning I live with that person. Okay, we get these calls all the time. I was with my boyfriend this weekend and he had a coworker test positive, right? That's not an exposure to that person, right? So you need to sit down with the person and find out, okay, how direct was this exposure and why do they think there was an exposure, right? If the employee is asymptomatic, they should self-quarantine for 14 days. Assuming this was a true exposure. And then if the employee does become symptomatic, then go back to the previous slide. They need to get medical attention and they need to stay home, okay? All right, so let's go back to, I think, Raphael's question, like if a worker is scared, doesn't want to come to work, or maybe it's just also, hey, I'm making more money staying at home, right? So I guess I should talk about that one first. We do have those scenarios. We call somebody up, we have a job for them, and they say, no, thank you, right? The question is, like, why aren't they coming back to work? If it's a situation where they're making more money on unemployment, then all I can suggest you do is pretty much just threaten them that you're going to notify EDD, because at some point in time, I always say, EDD is dumb. They're not this dumb, you guys. They've got software for this, right? You're going to report, they're going to find out sooner or later that this person continued to collect unemployment. There will probably be a mechanism where we can say, hey, they turned down a job. also you'll have a situation if they come back to work and they're earning wages and they don't tell EDD and they collect unemployment. Both of those are going to be bad for the employee. There will probably be some sort of audit at some point in time, and that you will let them know, hey, I offer this person to come back to work. So I just tell the employees when we talk to them, say, look, one of the rules for unemployment, the criteria is that you have to be willing and able to work. If you are willing and able to work and you refuse work, that may render you ineligible for your unemployment, right? It depends. Are they, in a high risk category, things like that. So if an employee refuses work, they shouldn't be collecting. That technically is fraud. There is a fraud hotline. You could potentially report them that way. But they need to know that if the government finds out, they're going to come after them and seek reimbursement plus penalties and interest for the money that was paid to them. Okay, now, if an employee is scared and doesn't want to come to work, then I would sit down with them and ask them, or, not physically, but sit down with them and talk to them about, find out what's the concern. Is it a legitimate concern, or is it just a generalized fear, like, I'm just worried I'm going to get sick, right? If it's a specific concern, address it. They could say, oh, well, I don't have reliable transportation and I don't want to have to take the bus, because that's like a petri dish, right? So maybe there's a way that you can help them out some other way. Maybe say, Susie never wears her mask and she's always coming to my cubicle. Okay, well then go deal with Susie, right? So if it's a specific concern, then address it. If it's a generalized fear, then educate them, right? Make sure they understand like everything you're doing to protect them in the workplace, what they can do to protect themselves. Just educate them as best you can, and then tell them they need to come back to work, right? If they're in a high risk category, this goes back to, I think it was Athena's question, they may have protection under the ADA and also may be eligible for EPSL. So you want to tread lightly if they're in a high risk category. And again, I tell people, sometimes my clients think they have to have an all or nothing rule. Like, well, if I make an exception for this person, I have to do it for everybody. That's not the case. You just can't make exceptions based on age, race, and gender and things like that. But I can make exceptions. Like one of my clients is actually, they run urgent care centers, right? They had a whole host of different issues that came up for them. They had one of their nurses was pregnant. And she didn't want to, and I think understandably so, she didn't want to have to go into an exam room with a patient that had symptoms of COVID, right? And I said, well, why don't you just exempt her for the time being, have her deal with other patients when they come in, but I would not have her go in there, right? So you can do that. And then if another employee says, well, why not? You have an issue about protecting her confidentiality with regard to her pregnancy, but assuming everybody knows, you say, look, if you're pregnant or you have some high risk situation, then we'll talk about it. But, that's how we're going to support her right now, right? Make it a team sport. But generally, people cannot just refuse to come to work. You do have the right to terminate them, with the one caveat I would say again, if they're high risk or they fall under any of those scenarios under the FFCRA, tread lightly and probably seek some attorney advice or consultant advice on that. Okay, exposure scenario 4. If an employee tests positive, knock on wood, thankfully we haven't had a lot of this. We have had situations where a step removed, like they live with somebody that's tested positive, but I don't know that we have any of our clients anyway that have an employee that tested positive, but you obviously want to send or keep the employee home. The other thing about this, you're going to have to ask the employee to identify everyone they came in contact with in the past 14 days. And again, close contact, meaning within 6 foot for 15 minutes or more is the general rule to use. I would also suggest that you have them think through, for the last 14 days, think through what equipment they use, and ask them, did they clean up after themselves, things like that, in case there's additional information you need there. But you need to ask them to identify all employees with whom they had close contact for the last 14 days, and then you need to notify those employees of the possible exposure, all right? But here's why without is in capital letters. You may not identify the employee who tested positive. That is private information. It's personal health information that needs to be protected, and you should not release to other employees the name of that employee. You just need to say that we've been advised, right, that you may have come in contact with somebody who's tested positive. People will figure it out, but it shouldn't come from you, okay? You want to thoroughly clean and disinfect the work areas. You can choose to send everybody home. You can choose to send just the people home that may have come in contact with that person. You should advise those employees to seek medical advice. I I would have them self-quarantine. And then what the CDC is now advising is they can return to work after 10 days of that exposure if no symptoms developed. But obviously if symptoms develop, we're back to one of the other slides there. And if they can get tested and are being tested, then they should have 2 negative tests in a row, at least 24 hours apart. And then at that point, they can come back in, okay? So either no symptoms for 10 days, you know, or I'm sorry, if no symptoms develop, then they can come back after 10 days, and then 2 negative tests in a row if they can get tested. All right, just one more thing, and then we'll talk about any other questions that you have. So PPP loans, you know, the funds are to be used in the 8 weeks following distribution. Congress has a bill pending that would extend that time frame. It's super challenging for some of my clients that can't open because of their industry. Hopefully, the PPP loan rules get changed to allow you more flexibility. I think the Congress bill that just went through on the House side said like 24 weeks or something like that. You want to be really careful about maintaining documentation on how the money is being spent. The best practice is to open up a second bank account and have the funds right there so it can be traced. SBA has released a forgiveness application. So if you go on that link down there, you'll see the final rule regarding loan forgiveness. Talk to your bank, because the forgiveness actually goes through your bank or whoever provided the loan, you know, you received the loan through. And then again, one more time, maintain written confirmation of offers that are made, and especially if the employee refused to return to work because, or maybe they just took another job or something like that, because the SBA said they're not going to reduce your forgiveness based on that. Okay. All right, I put some important links in here just at the back for you, and I'll take some questions in here again as a slide, and I'll just one more time remind you, if you're on the call and you have a certification for HR through HRCI, just shoot me an email and let me know that you attended today, and I'll be happy to send you a certificate of attendance so you can get credit for this. And then also I'll just say, Ernest, and I'll take any questions. In the back here, I included some bonus slides on the FFCRA because, again, a lot of us didn't have to deal with this because we were furloughing employees before that. But I put some slides in the back just to refresh your recollection on how you calculate how much you have to pay the employee and what the rules are around the FFCRA.
Thank you, Linda. We have a few questions.
Okay.
I'll go through them out of order, the order in which they were asked. So a question from Jenny, this is something you have covered already, but this is slightly different variant. If employees who have been furloughed and have been called to return to work, but employees are still concerned about the risk of COVID-19 and cannot work from home because they don't have reliable internet connection or they're not set up with the office space, then can these employees be negatively affected? Would employers report to EDD that employees aren't willing to cooperate?
Yeah, again, you can. I mean, I would sit down with the employer, have a conversation with them and ask them what their fear is, and then do what I can to educate them, right? Tell them everything you're doing to make the workplace safe, everything they can personally do. Because I mean, I have a friend that she already works from home, thankfully, but she's completely paranoid about COVID. You know, I met her for a bike ride a couple weeks ago, properly socially distanced. She had not just a mask on, she had 2 masks on, right? And she would make sure she stays 6 feet away from everybody. There are going to be people that have more of a fear than other people. I've also talked to people that said, I don't care about masks. I don't care about, you know, anything. I'm fine, right? So you have to sort of meet them where they are and talk to them from that perspective and see if you can move them forward, right, toward where you want them to be. So I would talk to them about what their fear is and see, is it a really specific fear that I can address? Is it a concern, so the sort of a legitimate concern, like, oh, okay, so if we go take care of that, then you're okay? And if they say yes, then great. If they're just unwilling to come back, technically they should not be able to collect unemployment. I don't know how you can notify EDD. And like I said, there's such a big lag time right now. I think EDD is going to just continue to pay them. Sooner or later, they'll figure it out, but it probably won't happen anytime soon.
Thank you. Question about testing from Janice. So I'm going to rephrase a little bit because now I think I understand what the question is. And the question is, should we get COVID tested as opposed to symptom tested before we go to work? She's a licensed acupuncturist. So I suppose that will apply to massage therapists, occupational therapists, and so on. Anybody who works with our
Yeah.
body, we work very close to patients. I would be more comfortable if I know that I don't have it before I go back to work. Any
Yeah.
requirement for
Yeah. So I would
COVID
say,
testing?
yes, I would say this, again, I provided the link where you can go get tested. If if you are the business owner and you have healthcare professionals, the rules are a little bit different. So I should tell you that there are different standards if you're a healthcare professional and when you can come back to work. So if you are in that category, do a little bit more research, right, on that particular industry. You can go get tested. Again, I provided the link. You can put in your zip code. It'll tell you exactly where to go. But there's no requirement to get tested for most of us, so it's really more about symptom checking. Also keep in mind, you could test positive or test negative today and then test positive tomorrow. So there's nothing here that's 100% foolproof. They're giving us the best guidance they can that makes the most sense. But we've seen that happen also, right? Where somebody gets a test, it's negative, and then all of a sudden, a week later, they have symptoms, right? Exposures continue. So I don't know that that's foolproof, but if you want to try, I would go on that website and see, if they'll just let anybody get tested, because I think that's what they're doing. They want people tested. So try it and see if it works. And then if nothing else, you'd be able to tell your clients, right? Hey, I, got tested and it was negative.
Next question. How do we deal with employees who are dealing with stress due to COVID-19?
Yeah. So
Are EAP programs going to be equipped with dealing with this new topic?
yeah. I mean, that's going to be, again, up to you and your employer to figure out. I mean, obviously, there's health professionals out there, mental health professionals that can provide counseling and things like that. I think there's a lot of sort of self-help groups that are out there. There's a lot of things you can suggest. And I think if you just Googled, you can probably, come up with a long list of things like how do we deal with stress or mental health in COVID. And there's probably people that have already written plenty of blog posts about that. The other thing I would say is, like, we were just notified yesterday of one of our clients' employees had a family member pass away from COVID. So that's horrible, obviously. And so my first response was they have an employee assistance program. So the first thing I would do is refer them to the EAP. So check to see if you have an EAP available, because that's a great resource. Another great resource is 211.org. So the number's 211.org. Like it's like 211oc.org if you're in Orange County. And from your phone, you can dial 211 and a GPS will know where you are and it'll connect you with the local 211 office. 211 is a great resource. It's basically all the social services agencies in the area. Those of you that work with the nonprofits know it well, but a lot of people don't know it. So there's plenty of resources through 211 that you could offer to your employees as well, whether it's mental health or maybe it's stress from finances and they can see if they can get some financial support, or they need food. Like, everybody's in a different place right now. So I would also suggest 211 as another resource.
Okay, we have no more questions on the board. It's not too late to ask more questions, but what we do have, Linda, is a lot of love and acknowledgement pouring in on the chat
Thank
about
you.
all the great information that you have provided them with.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
And then I'll leave it to, I'll open the space for you for last words.
Again, so thank you so much, Ernest, for inviting me in. I'm happy to help. We help our clients with this stuff all day long. And right now I just like to give to the community and try to make sure everybody's doing everything they can to bring people back safely. So if you have any questions or we can help you, please reach out. Again, if you are certified in HR and you want certification credits, reach out to me. My email address is on my bio slide, but it's linda@ethoshcs.com. And so you can contact me there. And if you have any follow-up questions we didn't get to, by all means, reach out and I'll do my best to answer them.
Do you have time for one more question?
Great.
It just popped out. Follow-up question. You mentioned the passing of a loved one. How do we address bereavement?
Yeah, I mean, whatever your company policy is, and again, feel free to do more than, would normally would do under these circumstances, because I think it's especially stressful. It's hard. I'll speak from personal experience. My mother passed away Easter Sunday. It's been difficult just for normal reasons, but also we've been cleaning out a 2,500 square foot house and no one's taking donations, right? So we've had to get pretty creative about that. We had a funeral service limited to 10 people, socially distanced, wearing masks, So there are some additional stressors on people right now when they have a death of a loved one. So I would just urge you to, have as much compassion as possible. Again, you have a bereavement policy most likely. If not, then feel free to do something. If the person has been at home, maybe you just cut them some slack, or even if they're in the office, give them some time off to deal with the situation and support them in any way possible. I think it's really more of just a company policy on bereavement, or allow them to take, additional vacation time that they have or something like that. But yeah, it's tough right now, and I haven't talked to the employee involved. I was talking to their boss yesterday, but we're going to try to do everything we can to support that person as well. I don't even know if they're, in their case, if they're local, if their family member was local or not, because that's an extra burden, right? If they have to travel someplace, because it's difficult for travel right now too. So anyhow, my condolences if that's happened to anybody out there.
Thank you. One more question. Should we extend longer because of COVID?
Should extend longer?
Should we extend longer? Not extend what?
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
Athena, if you could elaborate on your question, Linda would be happy to address it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is our new normal for a while. Obviously, phase 2 is opening up different businesses, but depending on the type of business you're in, you may, again, not be able to be open for a while. And even if you can't bring people back to work, consider leaving people home if it hasn't affected you from a productivity standpoint. Not every business that has that luxury, but like my CPA client, if you'd asked, the managing partner in January, February, hey, can I telecommute? He'd be like, absolutely not, right? Can't happen, no way. And then in March came, he went out and spent like $50,000 to get everyone laptops, and they've been working from home ever since. Now he's questioning whether he needs office space, right? So people are amazingly adaptive under these type of circumstances.
Mm.
So if you don't need to bring people back, don't bring them back.
Thank you. All right, time is up. This completes the webinar. Please stay tuned for the announcement for next week's webinar. We're going to send it by email. We're going to have Rafael Durand, Executive Coach at ECofOC. He's also the CEO at the Expat Consulting. And he's going to be talking about the Learning Agile Leader, the silver lining in times of change. So before you sign off, we would greatly appreciate it if you took 1 minute to respond to our very short survey to help us improve our service to you. This completes the webinar. Linda, thank you so much for doing
Thank you.
with us. And we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.